this computer. Hello, everyone, and welcome to our discussion for Module 2 for TEL 708. Tonight, we are talking about the data-wise improvement process versus the action research process. And we're going to just talk about key similarities and important distinctions. So I am Kelly McNeil. Most of y'all have seen me before. We have Bobby here tonight. We have Sandra, we have Melissa, and we have Kamara. So thanks for joining us. And I'll just kick it off and just kind of ask, do we want to, I guess, just like have somebody give kind of like what they think their brief synopsis or definition is of like data-wise improvement process? Like, what do you consider the definition of what is that?
Sure, I'll jump in. Well, I think of the data-wise improvement plan sort of very similar. I see a lot of similarities between the action research process, but essentially it's, collecting data and then analyzing it and then formulating some sort of problem of practice. They seem to focus more on a learning-centered problem that could then be, fixed through adjusting teacher efficacy, right, towards that problem. But whatever it is, you're identifying some sort of issue or need from the data and then making an action plan to address that, and then iteratively going back and trying to see if your adjustments, your plan did actually fix the problem. So in that way, I see our action research as very similar, right? We've identified the problem and we're working on creating some sort of plan to address it and then see if it's working.
Yeah. Does anyone want to define? I agree with that, like data-wise improvement process. Does anyone want to add to data-wise improvement, or does somebody want to talk about action research and just like definition of it, I guess?
I think if it's okay, I might do neither of those, but maybe ask a question, maybe Melissa, based off of the definition that you gave. One of the things that struck me, and it could just be that I'm only through chapter 6 in the DataWise book too, but one of the things that struck me was maybe a slight difference, though there are some action research plans that could start this way, but it really seems to be very based on, like, you have a chunk of data and you use that data to inform a question and then come up with, like, in the action research terminology that we know, like an action plan, right? And then go to it. And so, maybe it's like just a small difference, but I really did see this almost like we anchor ourselves in this data analysis and then we come up with a problem of practice or ask how that data informs that, maybe which is a little different than what maybe the action research is, which is more of observing a problem and then going out and seeking some data to inform that. So curious if others saw it that way. And then I'm still trying to figure out if there's iteration or if it is just like, here's the problem, we do this, now we're rolling it out to the whole school and we're assessing whether it works for the whole school or not.
So I think, I'll jump in. I think that one of the, I think you're right. I kept going in and out of, they're a lot alike, and that there's still some key differences that I see. And while the data-wise does seem to start with a big chunk of data, you still don't go into that data without having a sense of what you are looking for, right? Because, and it says that. So in that sense, both data-wise and the action research have to be anchored in something. Now, whether or not you have a body of data already there or not, they don't go after literature, right? So I mean, at some point, I don't know if I was looking at it too prescriptively, but one big difference I think I came away with is that when we look at data-wise, I kept thinking about performance management, the term performance management versus research and evaluation. And they're not the same. And oftentimes in institutions, or I don't know, I've swam in both waters, and like you have institutional effectiveness departments and then you have institutional research departments. They're not the same. So when I think about the data-wise model, I'm thinking about performance management. Something's off. What is it that's off? the way that they look at the data, they look at it from this performance angle, and then they go into some inquiry, like what can we do differently? What might faculty or teachers do differently? And so then we go into some research. I don't know either, because I'm suspecting that the third part, which is all about ACT, will get us into that. Answer your question as to, do they iterate? Do they do what action research has as develop and reflect, which is that cycle? But then when I think about action research, it's more about one person's.
I had that too, yeah.
It's like primarily it's critically focused on one person's practice. I'm not sure if that's true either, but I know that I read that in Mertler's book. So when you look at data-wise, I'm thinking like analyzing school data at like a broader aggregate level versus I have a problem with a practice in one classroom or something like that.
Just to jump into, you brought up a couple of interesting points. I think that I think it really depends very much on everybody's individual context and role, right? Because doing like the second paper, that activity, I used my interdepartmental level, which is like, as the school counselor, I kind of get lumped in with like all the extras, right? So there's like the religion, the creative movement, the gym, health, art, all the extra drama. And so we're like a department. So trying to look at sort of how we would approach that is very different than, say, the math department or, grade 5 teachers, and how they're going to relate to data and what their goals might be. So I think like even just that exercise made me see that you can approach both action research and data-wise improvement plan like very differently and still take away sort of what you need from it. Does that make sense?
I think so.
Prescriptive.
Yeah. And to your point about, Kamara, you were asking about the iteration. I went back and like reread, I guess, like chapter 2 for like the synopsis of action research, like from step by the steps, right? And like to your point, Sandra, about prescriptive, like I think I looked at it from a very prescriptive, and like I actually see, for me, I see some similarities, but I feel like I see more differences. I'm honestly having a hard time swallowing data-wise. Like I actually went and did more like looking up of research of like, has anyone ever said that the contra opinion to going this process, because something isn't sitting right with me with it. There's something about it. And I think it has to do with the words assessment. And I think it has to do with like student testing. And I keep pulling that, I keep focusing on that piece of it, of like student testing data. But I also see that collaborative inquiry, and I don't necessarily have seen those words as much in action research. When you read through the steps, just in a very prescriptive fashion for action research, it states like in chapter 2, like at the very beginning, that this process is not linear, that you can actually go out of order. Nowhere in anything that I've read so far with data-wise does it say that. It seems to be like this. And I wouldn't say linear, because like even its model is sort of like a spiral 9, right? So these are just like observations, like looking at it and trying to assess it and figure it out. I'm like, the name of our class, data informed decision making. To me, data informed decision making just seems like a no-brainer. It seems like, yes, it makes a lot of sense, but I'm still trying to figure out, I guess, like with the data-wise improvement, like what are, again, like the key differences, and is one better than the other? Do they work together? Like, do we like, and again, to the point of like our work that we're going to be doing, like our dissertation work, like, do we want to follow down one of these paths or the other? I don't know, but for whatever reason, it may be just a personal bias. I'm not really sure what it is, but something about like assessment data, student assessment data, like my whole head is like teaching to the test. Like that's just what keeps coming up for me every time I think about it. And I just have this like block. But I don't know. I don't know if that, Kamara, when you were asking about iterative, because I didn't get the sense of it in anything I've read yet, that like, then you go back to the beginning and like reframe your question. No, you look at testing data, you come up with a plan, you implement the plan, you move on. Like, I guess that's kind of how I feel versus, and even in action research, when it talks about act and reflect, it also mentions like sharing with the community, sharing in presentations, sharing in a dissertation. And it seems to me like, and it could be because we started with action research and it was like, this is how you formulate like your dissertation plan. And I don't know that data-wise improvement would be this applied the same. I'm just not sure.
I want to give Bobby a chance to talk, but I just wanted to say real quick that the 9, I think, addresses what you started off with, Kimara, which was that, like, what is the starting point? Is it data or is it like a problem of practice? And I feel like that 9, you know what I'm talking about, right? Like the arrow is them sort of jumping into like level 6 of the action research process where you start to analyze, but it is iterative. And they do talk about that at the end, you implement like your own action. Part of your action plan is assessing then how you did. So that part is iterative. And the only other thing I wanted to say was, you know, I am very against sort of the student assessment as well, but I kept trying to think of it as like, they were saying it could be a wide variety of data. You could think of data as like student interviews, you know, talking about how they're feeling or what their experience is in class or something like that. That makes it to me a little bit more palatable. But sorry, Bobby, go.
No, it's okay. Thank you. No, I totally get what you're saying, Kelly, about like the assessment process. But just as I'm looking at this figure, the spiral figure, the number 2, when I read that build assessment literacy it's in between the prepare and inquire part of that spiral. I think that's kind of up to the researcher or it's up to the teacher or the administrator, whoever is doing assessment stuff. I think it just depends on what's going on with the school or with the class or whatever it is. So for example, I think that, so like for my art classes, I kind of do my own assessment stuff and I build it from scratch. And it doesn't have anything to do with the tribal college assessment process itself. For me, it's just my own course and my own way of figuring out what my students are learning and how they're learning and if they're learning, you know, what kind of information are they getting. And just from asking my own questions, I learned that I'm getting responses that I didn't even expect. And so I think it just kind of depends on the researcher. I mean, maybe I'm wrong, you know, but I think it's just, it can be built from scratch. I think just from how I read this, it's just kind of going about your own way of creating your assessment process and then creating your own innovative process of how to improve the data-wise or do the data-wise improvement process, if that makes any sense.
I think what I struggled with, or what I would suggest too, is that, so having only been in higher ed, I think you really have to do some translation to try to see how you could apply the data-wise process in something that isn't like K-12, school assessment, effective teaching method, sort of things. Whereas like the action research process, I think far more easily translates to other contexts. And the book itself is so mired in, here's the story, right? And the story is, we start with our school assessment data. And then we get taught how to display that data to all of the faculty of that school in order to tell the story that we want to tell. And then we ask why. Then we find the problem of practice and we start to go through that process. So it was like, as you got later in the steps, it got closer to action research. But I too, and part of this is probably just because this used to be my husband's role in the school district, and it was all about assessment, right? And all of the data and all of that was figuring out how the school improved in its rankings and how the students, and yes, it was cloaked in, we want the students to become better learners and things like that. But the end of the day, there was state funding and all sorts of things that were attached to the performance of the school and how the students did on the test, right? So I think some of it for me is trying to pull it out of the context in which the authors keep giving examples and trying to say, okay, you know, Bobby, which is I think what you were saying, right? Like taking the concepts out and figuring out how can I apply it to my context. And if I take it out of this deep sort of K-12 student assessment data that the whole school is looking at, and then all of the fourth grade teachers are going to do this for math and all of the, you know, then I can start to see some similarities, but I think it's tough the way the book is written, frankly, for those of us that aren't in that context. And I just feel like I have to do a lot of mental gymnastics to say, okay, I get conceptually what you're saying and I can pull that out and do it. But then I get hung up on, but here's the protocols, right? Just like in meeting wise, it's like, here's the protocols and you follow the protocol, and the protocol is what we have decided makes this effective. And data wise has the same thing with the protocols. So are you really following data wise if you're not doing their protocol, or are you just sort of picking and choosing the things? I don't know.
That's a good question. That's really
wondering.
That's a really good observation. I like that you said that, because I have a tendency to do that too. Because I've always been that type of person who just, I have to follow a script or I have to follow like instructions. You know, just because that's the way my mind is built. I have to follow things the way they're written, or the way the book says, or, you know, kind of do things by the book sort of thing. But since I started teaching, I had to learn how to kind of create my own process, and especially with assessment stuff, because I'm the only art instructor, and there's no assessment for art, and there's no, like, my courses aren't even required. They're all just, you know, optional. Anyway, so I had to come up with my own process to do assessments, and I had to learn how to stop going by everybody else's set of instructions and just kind of create my own process. And so that was one of the things I had to kind of wrap my mind around, was just kind of pick and choose what works for me and what's going to work for learning how my students are getting information, and if they're getting good information, and if they're learning what they're learning, how they're learning. And so, yeah, I just kind of took it upon myself to stop following all of these like specific instructions, because it didn't work for me. It didn't work for my courses. So I think that's and that's a good question that you talked about, Kamara, was how, you know, if we're only picking and choosing, are we really following this process, or are we just kind of doing our own thing at that point? So
yeah, and I relate to both you and Kamara. Not that I've always been in higher ed, but the classes that I taught at the independent school, they were a project-based learning, emerging maker technology. It wasn't English language arts. It wasn't math. It was like the technologies that go in there. And I was not held to state standards or standardized assessments. That was never a part of my vocabulary, except for that I came through education via alternative pathway to credentialing. So like my undergrad was in IT, and then I went through a required community college. Here's how you become a teacher. And they made me write lesson plans according to state standards. And I hated it because I was like, I've been in the real world. Like, these don't match up to what kids actually need to know. And it just like, but then I got into my classroom and they're like, you build projects, you do 21st century skills. And it was all these other things. And so assessment data for me was rubrics. It was me doing research. It was me looking up people's research of how to, you know, because I'm not against assessment inherently. It's just the formalized way, Kamara, you were talking about, that they present all these contexts and all these scenarios, even though I am in like middle school, 6th grade through 12th grade. And now I work for a like research policy educational organization where I'm supporting teachers with professional development. None of my professional development is talking to my teachers about their assessment data with their students. And I don't know if I should be like, it's not what I'm like, I'm promoting STEAM and makerspace. And so, yeah, I'm finding I'm struggling like to find I definitely felt more comfort level, like, within action research. But anyway, we've got a few minutes to wrap up. Sandra, if you wanted, I know you haven't had a chance to, like, if there's anything else you thought since we've been talking, or Melissa, like, just to go ahead and wrap us up. We've got a couple more minutes left.
I just want to reiterate, thinking and listening to all of you, that I really do feel that there is a big difference between these two models. And one is because one is about improving performance at face value. Like, can we change X, Y, Z? I feel like action research is about the why. Why do we, it's much more grounded in research and in literature and in theories and I mean, and it could, so for some reason I'm thinking, one is not worse than the other, but they're used for very different purposes. And it is frustrating to come on this point. Like I kept making this connection when I think about the student services department at work, and they want to know, why are our students, you know, there are these 10 gateway courses and and this is in community colleges, they're failing. And if they fail those courses, their likelihood of not making it past that first semester increases. Okay, so what do you do about it? But we're not getting into the teaching and learning. And I thought it was a really interesting, I kept highlighting the fact that teaching makes a difference in student learning. Duh. But yet, duh is not so duh in school, right? So we're talking about, like, what do we need to do? We need to enroll them faster. We need to make sure that someone's calling them. I'm like, what about the teaching inside the classroom? That is not what comes out of these data decision conversations. I agree with a lot of the book, like how to prepare your team, data literacy. You've got people that look at this and freeze, and they can't even have a conversation. So they can't even deconstruct and then reconstruct the problem with you, because they're just either defensive or they don't feel like they can have a conversation. So I truly can appreciate the data-wise teachings of how to set up the environment so that people can come closer to data. Data literacy is a literacy that our students need, but so do our administrators and faculty. Like, as adults, like, we're not there either. So we're in this interim, like this, like, we got to all learn. But this, I think action research is much more about producing the why. Why does it work this way? Why aren't they learning that way? And to me, that's just sort of like under the iceberg. Like that's like under the water. And I find that to be real learning. It's almost like the data wise is about the signals, like the signals that are telling us something's right or wrong. And we might change something, but the real learning for us as to why something changes and why something doesn't change is more in action research. I could be totally off, but that's my gut right now. So
yeah, I just want to, I'll end with saying that I see it differently, but it's good, because I hear what you're saying, but I think that their emphasis on digging into the data and trying to cultivate that environment where people are willing to look at themselves and self-reflect and see how is my teaching causing this result in the assessment. That's sort of what they're getting at. To me, that's sort of a why. But I totally understand what you're saying. It's very focused in that one lane, whereas action research is much more widely applicable, I think.
That's a good point, Melissa. I think that's true, because we need both sides. So maybe the happy medium is that they're both very important parts of the overall improvement plan for our students, period. Right? They're just going to get at two different parts of the process.
Awesome.
Well, I just wonder if the starting,
No, that's okay. I was just about to wrap us up. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think the starting points are different is all. And I really liked what Sandra said about one not being better than the other. I don't know that these two have to compete. I just think that again, maybe see differences in the starting point and the perspective or the problem that they're ultimately trying to solve.
Agreed.
I agree.
I agree too. And I'm so glad to have been able to hear everyone tonight. I just really feel like we have such a spectrum of different perspectives to bring to this. And so I hope that everyone who is watching can hear and maybe relate to each one of us in some way. But thanks for joining us, and we will see you all next week. So have a great rest of your week. Bye.